Hi guys, and welcome back to day 26 of Inktober. Today I'm working on a piece that I'm using a couple different colored inks, and for the line work I'm using the Higgins Black Magic ink, which I am actually really in love with. I talked about it a little bit at the beginning of Inktober where this was a new ink for me and I had bought it because they didn't have the kind that I normally like, the speedball one. And this one is actually, I'm surprised at how much I like it. I wasn't sure how I would feel about it, but there's a few things that I really love. I love that it's really matte and it just has this very non-glossy, totally not shiny texture at all. It just feels really almost dry looking, and I like that look. I like how that actually ends up being, and once I get all the line work done and everything, I think it looks really sharp, and the matteness of it I think helps a lot. But also I've noticed that as I'm using this ink, it seems to dry really fast. Like with my speedball, I mean, I have to be careful with the Higgins too, I'll say that, but with the speedball, it seems like I would transfer the ink a lot more with my hand, or I'd accidentally touch wet ink and then place it somewhere and it would smudge, and it was absolutely horrible when that did happen, or when it ended up somewhere that I couldn't hide it, like on the face. And it seems like the Higgins, I do it a little bit less. I do actually end up smudging it a couple of times in here where I place my hand and transfer it, but it didn't seem as much as I usually have. And actually most of my pieces I don't do that at all. I think this might have been the first one using this ink that I did end up doing it. But I think that it does dry faster, but honestly maybe I'm just getting a little bit better at using the brush and not placing my hand on the ink. So it could just be simply that the inks dry at the same speed and I'm just not as bad at placing my hand on it. I'm not really sure, but I do love this ink. I'm actually really happy with how it's been behaving, and it's super waterproof, and I can start painting on it like right away. I don't have to give it any time to really dry out to make sure that it's not going to smear or anything. I've gone right into it and it's held perfectly. And for this piece, I sketched out straight on the watercolor paper, and I was using a red Col-Erase pencil. And I have blue and I have red ones, and I sometimes like to tailor the color specifically to what the color palette that I'm going to be using for the final piece with that color pencil, so that if I'm going to do something more warm based, I'll use red, and cool based, I'll use blue. And for this one, I knew that I wanted to do more of a magenta-y overall color scheme to it, really kind of monochromatic. And this pencil, I knew that once I started adding in those inks and adding those colors, it would immediately just kind of disappear into the background. And that's one of the big benefits of using Col-Erase like this, is that depending on the colors you use, it can very quickly recede and become much less noticeable. And I mean, I use it and I sketch it right on the paper, so it's not like I'm expecting it to totally be invisible, because if that were the case, I would be transferring it through a light box and making sure that I didn't have any sketch on it. So I don't mind if it shows. I just like that it has a very harmonious look to it, and it does blend in with the color scheme that I end up using. And I do actually like those, like the layers where if you look at it closer, you can see the steps in it, even though it's not like I glaringly have the sketch layer standing out. I like that when you look closer, it's like it kind of comes forward in some areas and recedes in others. And maybe that's just kind of by virtue of working on traditional media that I'm starting to enjoy some of those elements of it, because most of what I've been doing for a long time now completely has been digital, and when I'm working digitally I have that complete control, so I get rid of the sketch. It doesn't show through. I get rid of all these layers that don't need to be there, and eventually I have that very finished, polished end product. But with traditional, I end up with a lot more of a hand-touched approach, which, I mean, that's very obvious, but I feel like I can see the steps that I'm thinking through in the final piece, and I actually really enjoy that. I think that I've missed that a lot once I was getting really into digital. I've noticed that I kind of missed that, and I didn't realize it till I was doing all of these traditional pieces and able to see a little bit more of my hand in that piece and in the final product. And as I was working on the sketch for this, I was realizing that the fletching, I'm pretty sure that's what it's called, for the arrow, they were going to blend right into her hair. They were going to have very similar line strokes, and the shape had that very tapered look that the hair was going to have. And I knew from that point that I had to be sure that I could make sure that they stood out, they were differentiated from her hair, and that you could really read it, because that's definitely one of the biggest issues with art not being as good as it can be is if elements are not readable, if it's hard to see what's going on, if you can't tell where one object ends and one begins, it can definitely bring back the quality of a piece. So for this one, from the very beginning, I knew I had to make sure that those arrows were feeling very distinct and you can see where they begin and where they end. And as I was working on it, I was kind of thinking it through, and I decided that in the end I wanted to do that through the final coloring of this piece. I did not want to try to solve that through the line work because I wanted it to have that similar look, and I wanted it to have those similar lines, so I knew that through the color I'd be able to do something that helped it really stand out. So as I was working out kind of how I wanted the colors to be set up for this one, I knew that I wanted a very purpley magenta for her hair. So I decided that I wanted the arrows to be very gold, and this was good in two sides because one, it's metallic, so it'll catch the light and immediately it'll come right forward and it'll be shiny and you can see it. But also it's a little bit of a complementary color to the purple base in her hair, so that you have the yellow of the arrows and the purple in her hair, and it just really helps it to pop away from that. And in the end, I'm actually really happy with how it does end up turning out, and that it is something that's no longer indistinguishable from what was behind it. But to get this color, I actually ended up mixing two different inks. I used the Dr. P.H. Martin Red Violet ink, and I also used the Diamine Grape ink, and I mixed those together, and that turned out to be this really deep, beautiful magenta color that had these really nice purple tones to it, and it was really pretty. I made sure that I tested it on a scrap piece of paper so that I did have it mixed the way that I wanted it to, and I also added water a little bit to this so that it would be a little bit lighter, and that actually was really helpful because after I got the whole wash down, I knew that I didn't want a lot of shadows to this. I wanted it to be really a very graphic read and clean and just crisp, but I did end up going back in with that same wash of the ink that I mixed. I just added a little bit of shadow around where it would be really, really deep, and that was just enough to help in the area that was coming forward and was above it. It helped it pop a little bit, so it wasn't quite so flat, but it wasn't distracting, and it was just enough to deepen that color a little bit more. But I absolutely loved that color. I think it turned out really nice. I'm really excited about how absolutely saturated these colors are that are inks, and how beautifully they just like spread on the paper. They really turned out really nice. But one issue that I did have with this Dr. P.H. Martin ink is that, and you don't see it in this piece because I've messed it up on a different piece before, but I was testing it out because I wanted to do line work with this ink because I thought it'd be really cool to have a really pinky line work and then have some of these more pink tones for the ink washes themselves. But it's really, really thin ink. It's very watery, which I didn't really notice or see it as a problem until I started using it as a lining ink, because the lining ink that I use, the Higgins Black Magic, it actually in comparison is very viscous, so it holds to itself a lot better. So when I put down a line, it will kind of clump together and you'll see where it's like ridged up and sitting on top if you put too much ink. But this Higgins stuff, it like, if you put too much ink, it would spread out. So it was getting these really fat lines, and it also was not nearly as opaque as I expected it to be. Because when I've used it for washes before like this, where I just color in the area, it looked really opaque and really solid, and it looks super good like this. But when I was using it for line work, you could see a lot more patchiness. You could see where some areas were more translucent and then some areas were darker because there was kind of a layering. So I wouldn't really necessarily recommend these inks for line work, and I don't know, there may be better colors that are darker or that work better or are more viscous, have a better texture for that, but this one did not work, which was pretty unfortunate because I was kind of excited about using it that way. But I'll just have to use it in a way like this where I'm getting these really nice crisp ink washes basically. And this part is, as usual, my favorite part, when I can start adding all the shiny metallic stuff. This time I actually didn't use the gold ink that I have been using pretty much all of Inktober. Today I'm using this Finetec Watercolor. It's Mica watercolors, so they are really metallic and they're so beautiful. But yeah, they're water activated, which is great because some areas I go in so that it's really, really opaque, and this stuff is actually really opaque. That's what's so exciting about it and surprising. But you can also add a lot more water so that it's really thin, and that's what I did on the areas like right above her eyes. I kind of gave her this really shimmery eyeshadow almost, and that effect was something that I was really excited about. I hadn't really done something like that before where I let it blend out into a really faded out look, and it looked really pretty. I really liked it. So it's something that I'm going to absolutely use more of, that where I use a really, really watered out version of this paint. But yeah, this is the palette that I'm using, and it was great because it has a ton of different tones of gold. I actually ended up using this one, which is a really silvery cool gold. It still has a little bit of gold in it, but it's really pale. And I just kind of took each of them and compared them with the piece, and I decided that the other ones were just a little too oversaturated, so I decided to go with this one since it was a lot more soft and subtle, and I didn't want something that was matching the intensity of the color for her hair. I wanted something that was gonna stand out by being more desaturated and more pastel. But that is everything for today's Inktober. I loved working on this one. I had a lot of fun with just these really pigmented inks and this really shiny mica paint. I think that they went really well together, and I've never used these two things together, and I like how they played off each other's strengths. So I was really happy with the stuff that I actually ended up using for this piece. But again, this piece will be available at my shop right now, so I'll have a link right down in the very corner of this video and in the description, so you can check out my shop where she'll be listed, and I'll have lots of other prints and buttons and stuff. But yeah, and I'll have some close-ups too on my shop if you wanted to see a few closer ups, especially of where there's the gold effect, so you can see how it really shines. But yeah, those will be down on my shop listing, so you can check that out. But that is everything for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow at the next Inktober.